Well, good evening, Soundside Church. Pastor Aaron coming to you tonight and to your community group. I hope that you just finished reading Joshua chapter 6. That's right, the story of how Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. You remember the old song? Well, that was the story, right? God had promised this ahead of time. A couple of weeks ago, we saw Israel getting ready to cross into the promised land, and Jericho, that walled city, was the first city that they were going to encounter. And of course, here in tonight's story, we learned how God actually conquered the city for the Israelites under the leadership of Joshua. Well, like I've done in previous weeks, I like to act as your video tour guide. You're going to discuss the scriptures and what you read in your group, but I'd like to provide a little bit of background. I think that will help some of the stuff that you're going to discuss. So the first thing I want to talk about is the way the walls fell down. You remember a couple weeks ago, I showed you some pictures of how Jericho was constructed, how it was up on a hill, and so the hill formed part of the barrier, and then the wall on top of the hill was actually the outer walls of houses, kind of the low rent district of the city. And then, of course, as the hill sloped up behind those houses, there might have been another wall towards the inner part of the city where more of the important stuff was. Well, I think it is amazing how the scriptures describe the crumbling of the walls. Literally, it says the walls fell down flat, or the walls crumbled underneath themselves. And we're talking about actual houses falling. And if you think about the construction of the city, the way that it happened would have been that those houses, those buildings, would have crumbled. The stones and the building material would have fallen down that revetment, that hillside, providing traction and stability and almost like a weird kind of staircase to help the Israelite army get up that hill and into the city, which is why the Bible describes this group of Israelites on all sides of the city. Every warrior just went straight into the city because the way God brought that wall down actually provided access to get up that initial earthen barrier. So it's just kind of these little details make it so much more vivid. Well, but that does raise a problem, doesn't it? And this is kind of really what I want to focus on for the next few minutes, because when we talk about the Israelites conquering Jericho, for many of us, the question comes up, what right did the Israelites have to conquer a city, kill all the people, and take the land? And not just Jericho, we know that they will go on to do this to numerous other cities. They don't end up killing everybody in the land, but they do this to several cities. And we have to ask the question, what right do they have? Now, if you were brought up in Sunday school and church, that question may have never occurred to you. You may have just thought, well, God's the hero of the story. He uses Joshua, this great warrior. They conquered Jericho. Jericho is the bad guys, of course. You know, God promised the land to Israel, so therefore it was theirs by right because God gave it to him. And if that's your perspective on this story, I'm glad. Good for you. That is a very biblical perspective within the world of the Bible. But many of us have encountered people outside the Christian faith who have raised objections to what we believe, claiming, how could God command genocide? And if you've never been posed with that question, it is very likely that your children will. So let's discuss this for just a second, okay? One of my favorite modern theologians, Michael Kruger, wrote a very helpful article on this. It's an introductory level article, but I think it's helpful. And if I remember, I'll try to link to it in the notes to this YouTube video. You can go back and read that if you want. But he basically says this. He says, look, within the worldview of the Bible, this isn't a problem because the Bible teaches us a few things. God is holy, people are sinful, the world is broken, and God's judgments are always just. That is, they are always right. Now, that's very simple, but biblically, it is true. And I hope you check out that article. It reminds us of some things we should probably be thinking about. But for tonight, I want to go a little bit deeper into Scripture and just kind of bring you some ideas. I don't think we need to get God off the hook Okay? But I do think that we need to have some reasonable answers. And our reasonable answers go all the way back to Genesis chapter 15 and I think it's verse 16. In that particular passage, God has promised the land of Canaan to Abraham and Abraham's descendants, ultimately Isaac and then Jacob's descendants, which becomes the nation of Israel. So God promised the land to Abraham's descendants, but he did it 400 years before Joshua comes along. And God tells Abraham, there's going to be a delay. I'm giving this to your descendants, but it's going to be a few hundred years from now. And God explains the delay by saying, and this is Genesis 15, verse 16, because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. The Amorites being kind of a stand-in for all the people of Canaan. What God has just said to Abraham is, the people who live in this land today have not yet sinned enough to exhaust my patience. My judgment is not going to fall on them yet. And during that time, your descendants will become a nation. And then when the Amorites, when the Canaanites have basically sinned up to their limit, that's when I'm going to give the land over to your descendants. Now that may sound a little strange to us, but it shouldn't. I think, in fact, there's a very important lesson for us to learn right there, and that is this. God's patience has its limits. You say, well, what were these people doing that was so awful? Well, we can read about this, but one thing I do want you to understand before we do, and that is this. When God said that to Abraham, Abraham had just had a very interesting encounter with some of the kings who lived there in Canaan, and also a priest named Melchizedek. Now, here's the interesting thing about that story. It's Genesis 14. It's right before this whole thing happens. Melchizedek is a priest of the Most High God, our God, Yahweh, okay? And so that tells us that faith in the one true living God was present in the land of Canaan. That is, truth and true worship was available to those who believed. Okay, so it wasn't like this land was in complete, utter ignorance of the one true God. Rather, you had people who, instead of worshiping the one true God, turned away from the one true God, invented nature gods, made idols, and then pursued that idolatry with all sorts of sexual perversion and brutal cultic practices, including child sacrifice. Now, in the late half of the 20th century, it became popular in archaeological circles to deny that the Canaanites had ever practiced child sacrifice. But more recent archaeological discoveries are saying, no, we were right all along. Child sacrifice was a part of what these people were doing. So when we read later in Leviticus chapter 18, a list of sexual perversions and child sacrifice, God explains that because of these things, the land is going to vomit out the Canaanites. And then we get a passage like Deuteronomy chapter 9. This was spoken to the Israelites right before they went into Canaan. And here's what God said. Know therefore today that he who goes over before you as a consuming fire is the Lord your God. He will destroy them and subdue them before you, so you shall drive them out and make them perish quickly as the Lord has promised you. Do not say in your heart, after the Lord your God has thrust them out before you, it is because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me in to possess this land. Whereas it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is driving them out before you. Not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart are you going in to possess their land, but because of the wickedness of these nations. The Lord your God is driving them out before you, that he may confirm the word that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. What is happening here is that God's judgment is falling upon Canaan. God is using the Israelites as an instrument of his judgment. God does this in the Bible. He uses human agents as instruments of his judgment. Later on, he's going to use other nations as instruments of his judgment on Israel. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, and then, of course, Persians are going to come. God uses instruments, human instruments, to accomplish his purposes. And so in this particular instance, the Israelites are the instruments of God's judgment. Now, if you have a problem with the word judgment, let me just replace it with the word justice, okay? Because that's what it is. And so it has nothing to do with Israelites committing genocide so much as it has to do with God's judgment for sins. And you say, well, that doesn't sound to me like it's very right. Please understand there was a lot more going on than what you or I know about. This was between the Canaanites and God, and Israelites were used as God's instruments here. So I don't know if that makes things feel any better for you, okay? But when we understand it in these terms, we recognize that what was going on here was not the same thing as like the Rwandan genocide. What was going on here was God was executing his purposes, and he could have used human instruments to do it. He could have used natural disasters to do it. And so what we understand is whatever God is doing is right. And you say, well, what about the women and children? Well, theologically, we understand, there's nobody who is innocent, okay? But we also believe in God's mercy on young children and infants, and that God knows what he's doing, and that they receive his mercy through the blood of Jesus Christ. That's another topic that we could develop a lot further. That is how we kind of understand this whole idea, and we're going to encounter it throughout the book of Joshua. I may reference back to this video. I don't pretend that it makes it any easier, but we do need to understand our God is a patient God, but his patience has limits. All people are sinful, no people more deserving of judgment than any others, but God has his own times and his own purposes. Sometimes he uses people to accomplish those purposes. Sometimes he does not. But in this particular case, that's what's happening. And so when we read some of these stories of intense violence, let's recognize exactly what Dr. Kruger had to say, all right? God is holy, people are sinful, the world is broken, but what God does is just. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to your community group leader and let you guys jump into the discussion tonight.